I'm pleased to say that we have Dr Nev Jones, and she is going to be giving a talk on the adaptations of early intervention in psychosis in the US, with an emphasis on addressing social and structural determinants, which is quite pertinent to a lot of the work that we do here in Scotland. Next slide, please. So my name is Ashley Hose. I'm a Senior Improvement Advisor in Healthcare Improvement Scotland, and I've been leading on the Early Intervention in Psychosis programme for the past 18 months. Next slide, please. So just a wee bit of housekeeping. Hopefully everybody's familiar with MS Teams. We have put everybody's cameras off and microphones off, but if you do have any questions, and please do think of any you have for Nev as she goes through the presentation, if you pop them in the chat box, then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. And next slide, please. So we will be recording this webinar. We find it useful for those who can't be here to be able to share the link and catch up at a different time. So we ask that you don't record the session, and we will make this available on our webpage, and we will also email out to you all. And next page. You might not access these links just now, but we have a lot of resources about our programme. We did a webinar on it last month to give an update on where we were at in Scotland with our programme. So we do have a web page. It has all the previous webinars on it. It has all the resources and a bit of information about the programme, as well as case studies that we've been working on. So what we will do is we will these links will become interactive when we send out the slides to you all, and we'll make them available for you. Okay, and next slide, please. And what I'm going to do now is just thank Nev very much for coming along. She is in the US, so I think she's probably just finished her breakfast after we finished our lunch, and has kindly come along to come and share her slides and give a good presentation to us. So we've got until 3 o'clock today. So Nev's going to give us a chat, and as I say, use the Q&A, and we'll come back to any questions when she's finished. Okay, Nev, I will pass over to you.
Awesome, thank you. Well, it is great to be here. I am just going to start the PowerPoint. Okay, everybody can see that now and hear me? It's good? Yes, okay. Awesome. Well, so just to tell you all a little bit about myself, you know, a few of you I have met, I believe, when I was in Scotland and or on other trips to the UK, but most of you I don't know. So I started out in the US as a service user in specialized early intervention in psychosis in an early program here in Chicago. It was after that that I got my PhD, and I have been, you know, solidly for about a decade and a half, very, very involved in the kind of the US rollout of early intervention services, policy, program development, implementation across the US. And I have worked in a variety of different roles, including more direct roles within the mental health system, directly overseeing early psychosis services, quality improvement, evaluation, and implementation, as well as then in policy roles. I worked for the state of California, kind of literally overseeing state level policy for EI implementation, which is, I believe, California is probably actually much larger in both kind of population and size probably than Scotland. So very, very large area, very diverse area in terms of both sort of population characteristics across different parts of the state, and then degrees of, you know, everything from very urban to very rural. and both urban poverty and rural poverty. And then I now really kind of work more in an academic role. I do kind of teach and engage in kind of clinical training wherever I can. And again, right now, primarily in social work, which, as I'll explain, unlike in the UK, social workers are really the backbone of early psychosis services and public mental health services in general in the US. So the primary interventionists tend to be social workers here. So that's kind of the background I bring. I have spent quite a bit of time traveling in Europe, the UK, and Australia, visiting and really kind of coming to understand a lot more about differences in implementation of EIP or EPI services in other countries, Canada as well. I actually just got back from Montreal. What I would say is that I have learned a lot from that, from really kind of seeing differences at multiple levels in how other countries and how other national systems have implemented these programs, and hope to kind of, reciprocate some of that, in that things are organized in some ways quite differently in the US. But I think there's something really kind of to be learned from that, even though empirically we really do not have cross-national comparative effectiveness studies except in pretty small ways. Folks in Montreal have done really interesting work comparing an early psychosis service in Chennai, India to a service in Montreal. But that's kind of an outlier. In general, we're not really doing much in the way of kind of comparative effectiveness research to understand how different adaptations of this sort of kind of basic EI model are actually impacting service users. Okay, so just for those of you, and this may be redundant, right? But just as a kind of really brief refresher on, kind of why EPI, what is the case being made across a variety of kind of national contexts, and what are the goals? What kind of sets early intervention apart from other kind of coordinated or multidisciplinary care models, of which there are many in the sort of SMI space? So one of the big goals internationally was giving youth and young adults access to services and supports as soon as possible following onset. In many countries, access to more intensive services would be delayed, and in many contexts require reaching a certain point of sort of established disability or need, and then these more intensive services are offered. So essentially, once things have already gone, potentially kind of quite awry in a young person's life. And, the goal here is to really prevent precisely those harms. So, for instance, school failure, job loss, social exclusion, damage to relationships. Those can be family relationships, relationships to friends and peers in a school setting. And then not just access to any services, but access to more holistic, multidisciplinary services. And so there were a series of studies in the late 80s and 90s that found that rapid provision of really medication-centered early psychosis services that, focus primarily on symptoms and symptom amelioration demonstrably, empirically failed to improve functional recovery rates. So when you gave somebody medications right away, it improved their symptoms. Symptomatic recovery rates were higher, but compared to controls, functional recovery rates were not. So I think one thing about EIP or EPI models is this focus on functional recovery really as the goal rather than clinical recovery. And why multidisciplinary teams? I think there's a very strong kind of rationale and accumulating evidence that has tried to kind of look more directly at the team-based nature of EI services, is that it kind of significantly improves engagement and quality of care, as opposed to more traditional models in many countries where you might have psychiatry, a psychiatrist over here, a therapist in a different building. They're not really talking to each other. And so they're not working together to problem solve and bringing the perspectives of different disciplines into the same space, into the same team to problem solve. And then other peer specialists get added to that, supported education and employment workers, family specialists, et cetera, depending on the program. The specialized psychosis focus, and again, in most countries, one would also say a specialized youth focus, although, you know, as I'm sure you all know, in England, EIP services kind of ended any kind of age cap, so they now go up to, I believe, age 65. But in most countries, and most of the literature really is youth and young adult focused, and that is in most places kind of fundamental to the model, that it's creating an environment that is youth friendly, and that is sort of oriented to engaging youth. But then the specialized psychosis focus, right? So many generalist and primary care services are going to lack specialized training in psychosis, and usually in EPI or EIP programs, even providers coming in without prior training are going to get that. They're going to get that both intensive, immersive exposure, supervision by you know, kind of experts or experienced senior providers, supervisors who really know how to work with folks experiencing psychosis. And so that's a really, really important thing here. And we know that providers, and this is unfortunately true across, you know, kind of around the world, often, in fact, hold stigmatizing, non-recovery oriented beliefs, especially about, for example, schizophrenia diagnoses. And the other thing I think I would say here is that a specialized psychosis focus kind of encourages on-the-ground innovation, bottom-up innovation from programs that is actually psychosis-specific versus more generalist youth mental health settings. And you say that, and actually when I was just in Montreal having long conversations about this, because in many countries we see now these generalist youth mental health models being rolled out, but because they don't have that psychosis focus, young people with psychosis are likely to actually be in a relatively small minority, and it doesn't become the center then of what kind of providers are grappling with or their creativity. And so it's really important to have both. But psychosis is obviously a really kind of particularly high need area in which that sort of immersion of providers who are then starting to adapt and innovate and try out new things, and those can really influence the field more broadly, is very, very important. So that's just kind of a brief rationale. Why psychosis then, as a reminder? So of any kind of psychiatric disability group, psychosis, and especially schizophrenia spectrum psychosis, but, you know, part of that is just because the criteria, at least, you know, in the US, the DSM criteria essentially kind of build in a higher level of disability. But highest likelihood of long-term and underemployment and poverty, really, really, really high. And we look at reviews that look at this across countries, and we don't see exceptions. There's really small variations in kind of outcomes from psychosis, and a pretty consistent pattern of pretty extremely kind of poor long-term outcomes relative to other psych disability groups. Really high risk of street homelessness, of ending up unhoused, of incarceration, especially in the US. So again, this varies. Australia has really high rates of incarceration as well in the prison system. I think that's a bit lower in the UK. Public stigma that's demonstrably worse than any other psychiatric diagnosis except substance use disorders. And stigma is actually worsening rather than improving over the past 20 years. And again, there's a group in Germany that's looked at this all over the world. This is not like a US phenomenon. Everywhere we actually see a worsening in stigma vis-a-vis schizophrenia, because that's usually what's studied, versus, say, depression or anxiety. So there's really, really a real need to really focus on psychosis, given these kind of really kind of high and disproportionate risks for a variety of poor long-term outcomes, increased vulnerability to just a kind of social conditions, poverty, et cetera. Why social determinants? Because I'm going to be kind of weaving an emphasis on social and structural determinants throughout this presentation. So why should we be paying particularly heightened attention to social determinants in the context of psychosis and in the context of early intervention? So, essentially sociostructural determinants, we now know, influence everything about psychosis from, kind of epidemiological risk of developing psychosis, and many epidemiologists are arguing that it is a causal factor. It's not just correlational, but it's actually a causal factor, and there's a lot of work looking at mechanisms by which things like poverty, food insecurity, housing precarity while growing up, trauma exposure, racial discrimination, immigration and adversity, etc., are really causally connected to the development of psychosis. Then access. Who gets access to services? What type of services are they? What are those pathways to care like? In many countries, we see significantly kind of elevated rates of police involvement or adverse pathways to care for minoritized groups. And who those groups are would usually be sort of defined locally. But people who grow up in social disadvantage are then more likely to experience these adverse pathways. Major influences on treatment engagement and therapeutic alliance. And some of my work looks not just at whether somebody is attending services, but really the quality of their relationship as they perceive it with providers. Even if they're going to appointments, how do they really kind of feel about the providers they're working with? Quality of care. And again, this includes within EIP itself, but also in kind of settings prior to EIP entry. Some of you are probably familiar with studies in London that have looked at and just exponentially excess rate of coercive interventions in acute and inpatient settings for British Caribbean origin, so Black British Caribbean origin service users in terms of, emergency involuntary holds, and then use of seclusion and restraint in inpatient settings, as well as things like involuntary injections. And we see similar patterns in other countries. And then trajectories and outcomes more broadly, right? Again, whether we are thinking about kind of functional recovery in a holistic or sort of kind of global sense, specific aspects of functional outcomes like employment, education, educational access, physical health, massively influenced. So physical health disparities within psychosis massively influenced by sociostructural determinants like food insecurity and poverty and not having, kind of access to healthy foods, not having access to green space to exercise, on and on and on. So these ripple effects are really profound. And in my work, I really argue that we cannot within the field or the space of early intervention and psychosis continue to develop services without really kind of fundamentally centering social and structural determinants. And I just wanted to just add on some, I think kind of a few of these I said already, but sort of why EIP in the larger sense of kind of policy. What have been the ripple effects in other areas of mental health care? So really kind of this has in many countries seeded the sort of development of specialized training on more of a systems level. So you see national centers of excellence, you see county, provincial, or state level centers of excellence who are now, kind of really investing in workforce training development and then kind of coaching and implementation supports. And that trickles out, right? Because once there becomes more of a specialized psychosis focus, even if it's early psychosis, it starts to kind of spill over into really kind of psychosis care, treatment, and workforce capacity across the lifespan. It has helped to garner political support for psychosis where it would otherwise be absent. So youth and young adults are generally much more of a priority for politicians and policymakers, quite honestly, than other groups, than, let's say, middle-aged to older adults with psychosis. And so by focusing on youth, the youth-young adult part is often appealing. It's more popular with voters and constituencies. And so this is a really good thing because, in fact, those investments do start to kind of trickle down across the lifespan to psychosis in general. But it has enabled in many countries kind of national funding to be obtained where I think otherwise it would not have happened. Innovations in financing in many countries. So as they have attempted to really expand EI services to serve true population need, there are, of course, financing difficulties. These are not inexpensive models, but I think a real impetus to be creative with financing mechanisms and with how programs are structured. And then again, as I already said, this focus on holistic functional recovery is really, really important. It's really moving away from sort of the medical mainstays of therapy to some extent, right? And medication management really as the primary tool across the lifespan for dealing with psychosis. So that sort of movement away is really, really important. And then now I'm just going to kind of talk about, and if people have questions, like definitely start putting them into the chat or the Q&A. I really want to talk about how adaptations have been happening at the team level, and I'll go through a series of these in the US, just to give you a sense of sort of what is happening to make this work to scale and with resource shortages, with workforce shortages, et cetera, et cetera. So medication, medication management in the US has often been kind of shifted from psychiatrists to nurse practitioners, but you sort of see that continuum. Psychiatrists have a much higher level of training, nurse practitioners have less. So in the US, we can, in a task shifting, a version of kind of medication-related task shifting, nurse practitioners can prescribe medications under the sort of distal supervision of a psychiatrist in most US states. Therapy, again, really variable. So, ranging from primary ongoing master's level therapy to time-limited therapy provided by a clinical psychologist. And again, we see much more in England, right? In the NHS, EPI models, we see much more involvement and integration of clinical psychologists. Why, as I'll talk about more, this doesn't happen in the US is simply the cost. It's not there. Just the workforce is not there. The money is not there to pay for clinical psychologist time. So it's really kind of shifted back onto master's level clinicians. Who the primary worker is varies a lot by country. And I know both in Scotland and really throughout the UK, there's a much more of a central role for mental health nurses. In the US, it's more social work and counseling. How and whether family specialists or family therapists are integrated, peer specialists, same. Supported education and employment, same. And in some countries, they're really kind of OTs are employed, occupational therapists who have a master's degree and really kind of a level of kind of specialization. However, it's yet another one of these cases where in like kind of resource shortage areas, the funding compensation pay for an OT is often not there. So we rarely see this in the US. But I think in other countries, there's often been more of a focus on kind of fully trained occupational therapists. And then another big area of kind of variation is kind of case management, benefits coordination, housing support. And I'll talk about this more, but, obviously here we're really, really talking about social determinants. So how much emphasis there is in a given model varies. And a lot of that does have to do with the level of attention to, but also perceived need for these kinds of services. There are adaptations of the sort of the core team model based on place. So in rural catchment areas, hub and spoke models are really kind of probably the primary dominant adaptation, but that takes different forms. So in the US, I think what we see most often is that you have a hub that represents all the multidisciplinary roles, and then outreach workers, often who are located more proximal to rural population. So if you have like one central city, I should have had a figure diagram here, you have small offices or an office rented out so that the primary place, so that the outreach workers have somewhere to go. And then they do generally in-home and community outreach, often because there's no public transportation, there's not there's not buses often in really rural areas. So they really have to meet people in the community, in their homes. And these outreach workers or providers in the US often combine the roles of kind of multiple multidisciplinary team members. So I've seen in rural parts of the US, peer specialists being employed, except that they are providing benefit coordination, supported education and employment services. They're not just doing sort of narrow peer support work, or it might be case management. I've also seen people whose primary roles is supported employment, but who are in fact kind of doing a little bit of everything to support that person. In the US, in rural areas, there are often extremely high levels of distrust. And just where I'm located in Pittsburgh, adjacent to Appalachia, so Appalachia notoriously is one of the poorest parts of the US, highest rates of disability, and also many communities that literally don't even have basic amenities. Some don't have phone lines, some do not have operational kind of sewage systems at all. So it's pretty extreme kind of rural poverty and a lot of distrust of kind of people from big cities, of kind of perceived authority figures. So the teams, the outreach workers really, really have to actually work to build trust and engage the community and be there. And that's a different kind of role even from anything kind of equivalent in your more classic urban program. And then again, in areas with psychiatrist or clinical psych shortages, we don't have them. So we don't have psychiatrists, we don't have clinical psychologists, period, in many EPI programs, but instead a nurse practitioner under supervision of a psychiatrist. Again, master's level social workers, and they're often really, so unlike in the England, right, in the kind of English NHS model, there's a lot of emphasis on kind of evidence-based psychotherapy, really kind of CBTP being offered, whereas that is simply not possible in the US. The workforce literally is not there, even in large cities that have the highest kind of concentration of clinical psychologists. It's often not there for public sector programs. So what ends up happening is it's not really CBTP, it's CBTP informed or really more eclectic befriending. And when you actually kind of really interview public sector social workers, counselors working in these roles, it really becomes something kind of pretty holistic. They're looking at the individual. Maybe somebody's experienced trauma and wants to work on that. Maybe somebody is more dealing with, decimated self-esteem and feeling like they have no future. In other cases, it could be really, really deteriorated family relationships. And so just kind of really, I think, responding to the individual. And it would be incredible at some point to be able to compare that to models like in Australia and the UK, where there's much, much more emphasis on a particular therapeutic model and implementation to fidelity. We don't have that research, but it certainly is kind of different in emphasis here. And then there's other forms of task shifting, and we see that growing because post-COVID in the US, we have ever kind of more serious workforce shortages. And so trying to hire people who are licensed or who have a lot of formal educational training is just getting harder and harder in many areas. So a lot of thinking going into kind of how that work can be shifted to folks who are coming in with less of a background, with less formal training. Adaptations for vulnerable high disadvantaged populations. So here's my one Canadian example, because this is Amal Abdelbaki's work in Montreal. She created and piloted and evaluated, there's papers on this if anyone is interested, an early psychosis program with a specialized focus on housing, on serving unhoused youth or youth at risk, at very high risk of homelessness, so who are precariously housed, we would say. Additional basic needs and social determinants support adaptations we see in the US are programs having the ability to provide direct cash assistance with food and clothing, and how much of a range of cash assistance there is really varies. But some programs in the US have a pretty substantial budget so that people really kind of facing serious need can be supported, as well as then linkage to things like food pantries and other ways for kind of accessing resources. Greater emphasis on welfare system navigation, and of course kind of social welfare systems vary quite a bit from country to country, and in the US from state to state, in Canada from province to province, but are often complicated, right? Because the needs are based on different things. So some sources of benefits are based on disability, some are based on income or poverty level. Others may be based on things like, supporting a child below a certain age, or, mothers, young women who might be kind of pregnant. So it really kind of varies from country to country, and how much emphasis there is on really kind of helping, assisting, supporting a young person to navigate all of that and to tap into the sort of the maximal array. Then the extent to which there are staff with expertise in multiple systems, including in the US, a huge one is juvenile and adult criminal legal systems. And again, I think the US is a bit of a leader in the wrong sense here in terms of the extent to which we criminalize and incarcerate young people with psychosis, but these intersections are actually really common, especially for youth already coming from high disadvantaged backgrounds. So you need people on the team who can really, in a sophisticated way, help navigate those systems, various forms of diversion out, so like diversion courts and diversion mechanisms, as well as legal assistance and liaising with lawyers, attorneys who can, who are playing, of course, a kind of a critical role in navigating the charges that the youth or young adult may be facing. So again, I think this really varies because you can see university-based academic programs in the US that either don't do these things at all or do them to a much lesser extent than we might see some public sector programs in really high-need areas. It's just worth saying that these social determinants, right, that are being addressed, or that are, that teams are attempting to address, often intersect with minoritized ethno-racial identities. And so programs can also build in a more or less, kind of strong focus on cultural and structural competency and humility, and levels of attention to the ways in which racism is influencing kind of service users' experiences and trajectories, which is not a given in the US, right? So again, I would describe this as an adaptation of early EIP and EPI models that quite honestly were pretty blind to socioeconomic disadvantage to race, ethnicity, and other kind of minoritized identities and groups associated with social disadvantage and exclusion. So this is not, if you look at early works in the 90s, this was not being centered. These issues were not being highlighted, right? But I think providers on the ground most certainly are adapting because they are daily confronted with the reality of the needs that that young people are bringing to these programs. And this is just kind of one example. On Track New York, which is the statewide system in New York, has created an entire guidance manual for providers in New York State, which again probably is close to the population of Scotland or bigger, I don't know, but it's a very large, very high population state, and so this is a lot of different programs that this is meant to sort of influence practice. And this guide, which you can find freely online, no charge, no cost, very easy to access, really kind of integrates the cultural formulation interview, which if you are not familiar with it, in my mind, this is sort of the best part of the DSM-5 and really separable from other aspects of the DSM and diagnosis. It's really about moving away from a diagnostic approach to focus on understanding culture and how it influences what somebody wants, what they need. And this is not culture as in this is only relevant to ethno-racially minoritized service users. It's everyone, because this includes religion and spirituality, family relationships and family culture, et cetera. So just an example, again, that we don't universally see across EI or EPI services, but that we see in some. Adaptations in contexts involving historical exclusion and distrust. And in the UK, I have sort of seen and heard about work that in England programs are doing around the traveler community. In Australia and Canada, it's Indigenous or First Nations communities. There can be rural-urban distrust, as I mentioned, like in the Appalachian context. Differences in class, right? So service users who are coming from much more marginalized class backgrounds versus, leadership in the EPI service they're working with, immigrants, refugees, historical racial discrimination, legacies of colonialism where that's relevant. And I know, that continues in the UK in a variety of ways in terms of Commonwealth immigrants or refugees to the UK, et cetera. So adaptations that we see happening, really a greater focus on community outreach, and that is literally trying to build relationships with community leaders representing the marginalized group. And so that might be faith-based leaders, that might be kind of cultural leaders, otherwise defined. And the idea is to try to break down the perception, right? The negative perception of kind of government-backed programs that historically, in many cases, have really perpetrated oppression rather than actually serving marginalized communities. Really proactive involvement of the community. And again, not just service users, but those within the minoritized community who are perceived as leaders, elders, senior figures in service planning and development. And I think in the US, Canada, and Australia, we see some really great examples of Indigenous or First Nations elders specifically, including, for instance, some programs in California that work literally hand in hand with with healers, with elders from various American Indian communities to provide to youth who are American Indian themselves services that integrate that. So again, you don't see that if you look at the kind of big mainstream, kind of randomized control trials of EPI in any country. This is more what we see happening at the grassroots level, really kind of programs that, because it is locally so relevant, such a need, they're just adapting in real time and really kind of changing the nature of the services. adaptations for populations with high levels of trauma. So I think kind of in general, kind of trauma-focused components are one of the most rapidly growing specialty areas. A lot of research is happening in this space. Some of that, the more, kind of in a sense conventional form, is building in more screening and assessment and trauma-focused therapies. So that could be trauma-focused CBTP, EMDR, DBT adaptations, other trauma therapies. But I think to me, the more kind of systems level approach that makes an awful lot of sense is implementations of trauma-informed care, where really the focus is on structural and relational power imbalances and addressing them across a program, across an agency or a trust level in kind of UK terms. A focus on sense of safety within the kind of the culture and an organizational setting in question, and strategies to increase felt sense of safety and trust among, youth receiving services. Maximizing agency and control to service users. So the loss of autonomy, the loss of control, this is what happens in abusive relationships. You lose control, you lose autonomy, you lose agency to tell your own story, to think for yourself. I mean, if we're talking, for instance, serious relational abuse. So again, trauma-informed care is really trying to create or really kind of reimagine services in a way that moves away from that. So it's really, I just want to really emphasize that this is really distinct from screening and assessment and trauma-focused therapy provision. Not that those can't be complementary to trauma-informed care, but trauma-informed care really is a systems approach, not an individual level intervention. And I think, a lot of value across kind of socially marginalized groups, because by definition, growing up in poverty, exposure to violence, to abuse, to, everything is substantially higher. So by implementing trauma-informed care, we are potentially going a long way to starting to kind of address inequities that stem from socially marginalized backgrounds. Adaptations for youth kind of trapped in poverty and at risk of long-term unemployment. I think we're starting to see more attention to this, and that really involves alternatives to traditional supported employment models deployed internationally. This very much includes the UK, Canada, the US, Australia, etc., where IPS was the early kind of component within EPI. And IPS emphasizes rapid placement, and it is generally and empirically, this is well documented in low wage, often very low wage, typically non-living wage jobs. Low quality when we look at multidimensional indicators of quality, and non-career ladder jobs, or dead-end jobs, as we say in the US. And instead, really kind of trying to think about how do we build in more of a focus on long-term career development, on actual socioeconomic mobility, where the goal is to obtain at a minimum a living wage job, so that you're not working and still struggling just to pay basic bills by the end of each month, but it's an actual living wage job with, kind of associated quality of life, financial empowerment, and then again, concrete reductions in financial hardship, which is different from just having a job, because you can have a job and your financial hardship is unchanged. So setting those as targets and then really starting to redevelop services in a way that supports those goals rather than just a goal of immediate placement in a job. Also consideration here, I think, of the ways that, what sometimes get referred to as adaptive preferences, internalized oppression, or lowered self-expectations that stem from immersion, childhood immersion in poverty. And so really kind of understanding that youth from high poverty backgrounds are coming into programs at a significant disadvantage relative to youth from higher SES backgrounds, and that needs to be named and addressed, right? That actually needs to be a thing, that we talk about class, that we talk about poverty, that we talk about how people may have been discouraged from pursuing higher education, discouraged from particular kinds of careers. And I think the kind of the class elements of that are even stronger in the UK, including Scotland versus the US. And then adaptations for the new economy, because a lot of the original older models like IPS were really developed decades and decades ago. We have now the gig economy. We have micro credentials rather than potentially kind of completing a higher education degree, more entrepreneurial pathways. So, how can kind of services support goals in a meaningful way, including socioeconomic mobility, but that doesn't ignore these new possibilities, and some of them are fraught possibilities. Like the gig economy can be very, very exploitative, but it also has opened up various kinds of possibilities that are arguably less so. And then just quickly, can we say what's better or worse empirically? So what I feel bad about, here in presenting this is we really can't. There has been incredibly minimal comparative effectiveness research, as I mentioned at the beginning. Population differences are substantial. So in many cases, we would in essence be, comparing apples and oranges. And those, even within a single country setting, vary so much who you're serving. And in a sense, you should serve different populations in different ways to best meet their needs, which conflicts with kind of more traditional kind of clinical trial models of kind of establishing effectiveness. Again, other kinds of differences in surrounding systems of care and service availability, because if we're talking about holistic functional recovery, what's available in terms of housing, cost of and access to higher education, employment, and what the labor market is like, what local labor conditions are like. There's a lot that is influencing outcomes beyond just the EPI program. And there is a little bit more on specific elements. So, for instance, there have been trials that have compared programs with versus without supported education and employment, or employing CBTP versus befriending, but generalizability is often really unclear. For example, in the US, we do not have the clinical psychology workforce in the public sector that that the NHS in England does. And so it sort of like doesn't really tell us much, in fact, about what it means to kind of maximize quality and strengthen outcomes in the US context, or even kind of strengthen the practices of the sort of the therapists or the clinicians. So lots of limitations there. Just want to check the time, which I can't see to make sure. I think we still have plenty of time, so I can just kind of quickly go through this. I worked on a project in the US, and this is really, I just wanted to sort of gesture towards the very heterogeneous, right, needs and priorities of service users themselves. So this was a large and qualitative project in the US, which was part of a huge national evaluation of the implementation of early psychosis services. And this is in the community. These are serving Medicaid clients, public sector clients in the US. And we looked at, so this is kind of quantized coding from these qualitative interviews, where we kind of asked everybody, what changed for you while you were receiving epi services. And then of the things that changed, which were the most important? And you can see just how incredibly variable this is. And nothing in terms of importance reached the level of a majority. Even under kind of symptomatology and psychopathology, the reasons for these reductions, and again, sort of this, is a bit of a reductionistic way to present qualitative data, but they were quite rich. And they weren't necessarily about psychosis, so self-harm, suicidal ideation, anxiety. Youth really talked about a variety of things. Sometimes they didn't perceive that their quote unquote psychosis symptoms were being helped, but these other symptoms were. And as you'll see on the next slide, not necessarily by medications, more often by therapy or therapeutic interventions, but all these other domains, social and interpersonal, attitude and perspective, treatment engagement and activation, and often not medication adherence there, but kind of activation with respect to kind of healing and a deeper relationship with providers and clinicians, functional outcomes and independence, general stability, functioning and health. So again, really, really variable. These are young people in general who are bringing all kinds of different needs, getting different things out of EIP, and then designating even of those things, which are the most important in very, very different and diverse ways. And then kind of the primary mechanism of change was also really interesting, which we asked. And so again, here close to a majority was therapy. Medications, you can see, was relatively small at 14%. Instrumental support. So this was things like specific examples would include navigating the criminal legal system, helping somebody, address their charges within the juvenile legal system, getting a driver's license, getting housing. A mix of them all, right, was another group. And then kind of mechanism not specified, like the youth actually said, like, I don't know, or it was just sort of the sum total of everything. And this is my last slide, and then I hope there are a lot of questions or discussion. But challenges that remain: discharge, step down, or transition to primary care or general adult SMI services. So what comes after this period of specialized epi access? We do know that at a net level, long-term outcomes for service users with multi-episode psychosis have not improved over time, and do not improve long-term in the context of epi services when they're just, withdrawn after a period of time. Greater personalization, because we end up with an extremely heterogeneous population in terms of need, both in terms of disability itself, how much a given service user in epi services is actually dealing with intense 24/7 symptoms, or a single episode and really kind of symptoms quickly dissipate, and these are two very different things, and then all kinds of trajectories in between. So how do we really, really kind of personalize in a way that maximizes our ability to allocate resources to those who need them most? Because realistically, we don't live in a world, any country in the world, that just has sort of unlimited resources dedicated to kind of what we call serious mental illness, right? So how do we become more efficient about actually making sure that those with the highest level of need within EPI get the most kind of intensive services and supports, and those who are at the highest risk, let's say, of unemployment, homelessness, poverty. This mitigation of long-term poverty and unemployment. So again, I think there needs to be a shift from thinking, well, if we just get in there early, and kind of address people's symptoms, they'll be back on track for whatever kind of life they would have otherwise led. That sort of is some of the operative logic in early concept papers for early intervention. And instead, we have a responsibility to really do everything we can to try to address social stratification and to try to promote true socioeconomic mobility and long-term equity. And I would say that this is not a inherent fault of early intervention, but rather that it has not been prioritized within early intervention, and that it's very likely that we would be making a much more substantial long-term impact with these programs if we really kind of prioritized setting young people up for a long-term trajectory of mobility rather than just sort of trying to address immediate needs and obtain immediate good outcomes, quote unquote. Okay, and that is the end of my presentation. So thank you all, and I will now, there we go.
Wow, that was brilliant, Nev. Thank you. What a whirlwind of kind of perspectives, sort of international perspectives on EI, and also both the strategic and systems perspectives, which is lovely. And it's so healthy for us to hear, because so often in Scotland we feel a little bit in a silo, especially because England seems to be so much further ahead and so well developed. So actually your talk was very reassuring in some ways, that we're managing to do some things roughly right. So it's really helpful to hear. There's a couple of questions in the chat that I want to go to, but before that, I was wondering if I could just quickly mention a few things. I think one of the things that you mentioned really struck me around about the cultural sensitivity, and that's kind of interesting for us, because I think Scotland's always been, although we've been poor, we've been quite a white country, and increasingly there's more immigration. And one of the things that we did in Glasgow was, I remember going to talk to the local Muslim radio station to try and capture young Muslim people who often are not attending services because of the stigma. And it's making me think, gosh, we should be doing all of that again, actually, reaching out to our imams and that kind of thing. I think trauma-informed care is quite a big thing here. We have a big strategy around that. There's a lot of training around that. And what I struggle with in EI, I think we probably have quite reasonable trauma-informed practice by and large, although inevitably there comes a point where sometimes people are taken to hospital against their will for their own safety, and that's difficult. I think it can be done in a very compassionate way, but it is ultimately part of the role of the service as well. Where I struggle sometimes is that we've got to be pragmatic. We don't have fancy, non-stigmatizing accommodation. We're based in a hospital site, and it looks like an inpatient site, and sometimes that's not ideal for young people who are not wanting to go near hospital. But it's the accommodation we've got at the time, and it's trying to make it youth friendly, I suppose, and think about how we can make sure it feels like a friendly environment that is collaborative, and first names and not the same boundaries, and I mean, I don't mean boundaries, but I mean things like formalities, that just to make people feel more welcome. I think the final point I want to make before I get on to the questions is around about your comment about the kind of investment in EI, what happens afterwards, and also the equality, but the levelling up stuff. So one of the challenges we have in Scotland is that people will often say, well, why should we invest in psychosis? Because actually we should be investing in all mental health services. And I mean, I think when you're in a system that's probably had underinvestment, that's a reasonable point. But I think what I always try and respond with is that the people with psychosis are some of the most marginalised in society, because they've had such significant structural adversity. And we know that most people have had multiple traumas. So actually investment in EI is about levelling up some of the disadvantage, because you're inevitably targeting some of the most disadvantaged groups. and therefore your investment is targeting that. But that's one of the challenges we have, is why do you invest in psychosis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thank you for all those comments. Yeah, and I do think you know, the conversation I was just having in Quebec really kind of centered on, I think in a lot of countries right now, the particular sort of tensions are between generalist youth mental health services and psychosis. Often those generalist youth mental health services do not fully even include, if not outright exclude, psychosis and more quote unquote serious mental illnesses or psychiatric disorders. So, I mean, I think that's one thing that happens. Another place you see this playing out internationally is between early psychosis services and long-term SMI. So certainly in Australia, there have been strong concerns voiced by the sort of middle to older adult SMI advocacy community about the erosion of kind of longer-term supports. So Pat McGorry, who you know, as some of you all know, is the sort of the grandfather of early intervention, always just says, well, we shouldn't see these things in competition with each other. I do think that is mostly unrealistic. It is certainly unrealistic in the US. We simply don't just keep putting money into everything. You kind of have to, we have a political system and a policy landscape where you have to make a case for particular things. I would just kind of go back to my slides on, this is why I tend to emphasize this extraordinary high risk of long-term poverty, unemployment, homelessness, and in countries that incarcerate en masse, incarceration. Because there is no question, empirically, absolutely no question about what it is that young adults with psychosis on average are likely to face relative to other groups. And those things impose huge societal costs. And so it's sort of kind of disanalogous. And another way to go is to say that across the board, the medicalization of, for instance, youth distress is not necessarily a good thing. Lots of ways in which we can kind of critique over medicalization and kind of reframing all youth struggles in terms of kind of clinical mental health, not necessarily like a positive thing, and actually may result in kind of recursive iatrogenic harm, because people come to think of themselves as sick or mentally ill who are not, who are dealing with kind of like adolescent distress that, you know, that most people do experience and pass through. So I think there's a lot of important conversations to be had about those very real tensions, which are playing out all over the world. There's no country in which you go and there's not these policy discussions about what to prioritize, what the kind of relative risks and benefits of prioritizing different areas are.
That's very reassuring, because I think there's a lot of concern here that EI might be invested in, and that would take money away from the main system. And I suppose what we're trying to argue is partly it's about an invest to save agenda, and partly it's about minimizing long-term damage, long-term harm, long-term morbidity, long-term disadvantage. But I think, you know, we've got a government who prioritize social equality and addressing inequalities, and also trauma and trauma-informed care. So in some ways, in my mind, of course, they should be investing in EI, because those things just match together so well. But that's really helpful to hear. One of the questions that's come up in the chat is around about substances. And I'm interested to hear a little bit more about that. We have quite a big issue with cannabis. I mean, I think that's ubiquitous in EI services, but you know, the cannabis is much stronger than it used to be, I believe. And you know, there are people who really have a lot of cannabis use. It's very difficult to disentangle psychosis from addiction. Sometimes addiction services are feel to be very disconnected. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts and sort of observations on that. I'm super aware that some of the states in America have legalized cannabis, control strength and potency and so on. And I've heard mixed anecdotal reports of increased levels of psychosis and lower levels of psychosis. And I'm just curious to hear your observations about all of that.
Yeah, so as soon as I saw that comment, I mean, I think absolutely substance use is huge. So why did I not put it in the slides? And that was partly unconscious. Maybe one could call this a form of Freudian like parapraxis, a Freudian slip of a kind, because it's so complicated, I think. So it's sort of an unconscious avoidance. I just didn't put it there. In the two-state early psychosis learning healthcare system that I'm part of, there has been a big effort to focus specifically on cannabis and cannabis intervention. So I think why I don't have answers, I have a lot of reservations. I'm not sure how we move forward in the most productive way, because I think what can start to happen for youth who are believe that cannabis is helping, which it may or may not, I don't want to be agnostic and sort of kind of judging, but very, very high rates of cannabis use in the US among service users in EPI programs, and the emphasis on kind of reduction or elimination of use rather than harm reduction approaches, which we see harm reduction in other areas in the US, especially around opioids. We don't see a lot of harm reduction in EPI programs around cannabis. And so instead, I think it often comes off as a sort of top-down, if you will, older adult from the youth perspective judgment. And I think it actually fuels a lot of disengagement, dishonesty, the perception that youth must be dishonest about cannabis use because they want to protect it. So I'm not sure that the strategies that we've taken are very productive in terms of responding to cannabis use. And here is one of the areas where I just kind of feel like very uncertain about kind of what we're doing, and that it may, empirically, I can't claim this, but it may be doing more harm than good in some cases. And in general, I'm ambivalent about a heavy focus on substance use, because I think it's a setup for an exacerbation of power hierarchies with youth, with nicotine, which is another area, tobacco and nicotine. We know that biologically it functions as a stimulant, which helps actually literally and documentably, demonstrably helps to kind of counteract some of the sedative effects of antipsychotics. So it's very complicated, and entering into a power dynamic with youth around substances is pretty fraught. Another aspect of this, which is complicated, is many youth will point out that their social circles, other youth heavily smoke cannabis, and so if they are no longer like able to smoke, that they're losing their friends, their friendships, and their social circles. And as much as one might say, well, maybe those are unhealthy or some unhealthy relationships, again, it's a very, very kind of big question marks around how we should be responding. So I think this is why I tend to just kind of avoid the subject, not to say it isn't really important. Also, meth-induced psychosis, which is a big problem in the US, but it's also very, very difficult.
No, that's difficult. I mean, it's interesting. Actually, one of our previous speakers was talking about a reasonably successful clinic they were running for people that really had long-term heavy cannabis use, and it was about really incentivizing people to find other strategies to fulfill the function that cannabis fulfilled, and not necessarily taking a don't smoke at all approach, but let's see what else is important in your life and maybe let's reward you for that. And it was really an occupational therapy intervention, but it was very powerful and did actually lead to people having more stable mental health for a period of time, because they were smoking less cannabis and they were more connected, I think, with their communities, either working or so. I think there's more. I think there's more to be done in early intervention services for cannabis, and I would include my own service in that too. I don't think we've got that bit right yet. And I hear what you're saying about being too evangelical about not smoke, because we know that people smoke, don't they, when they for self-soothing and all kinds of other reasons. But yes, we know that cannabis is a really...
I also, here would kind of make a social and structural determinants point, which is, once youth have ended up unemployed, out of school, kind of without meaning, structure, and purpose in their life, it kind of makes sense. Like, why would you not, if you find something, even that it numbs you, that it distracts you, why would you not do it? Because your life has been stripped of structure and meaning. And I think rather than the individualizing approach that says, like, let's intervene at that level, it's like, how do we restore structure, meaning, and purpose, really community and participation, inclusion, and integration to people's lives? And then naturally people may end up making different choices, and I think often do. But when they have nothing, there's no real motivation in a totally logical, rational way. In fact, a logical, rational motivation is in sometimes to kind of continue doing the thing. So, I mean, certainly this was true of me as well, back in the intensive kind of service user period where I had nothing, where I had no job, no school, felt I had lost everything. So I think we really, really do need to think from the perspective truly of youth and young adults who are receiving services, and think about why some of these behaviors may actually be very logical, very rational, and are we fixing the right things? And or social exclusion, discrimination, stigma, right, decimates one's self-esteem. And that's also not then just a sort of self-stigma interventions that we need. It's really kind of changing society, because it becomes a logical, rational reaction to that exclusion, to want to retreat, to want to find what easily can be quote unquote maladaptive coping strategies. And so, I really think it's important as a field, especially from a more structural policy perspective, to really take this seriously rather than maybe very kind of individual level, kind of fix the patient's behavior kind of interventions. But that's my perspective. And this definitely kind of comes more from a lived experience, service user, researcher place, right? Is that the clinician's goals may not really map onto a deeper understanding of what we need to address and change if what we want is significant improvement in long-term outcomes, rather than we manage to reduce this little thing in the present moment.
Yeah.
People may also return to substance use if they are not restored to a more kind of meaningful, socially valued roles, right? So we might temporarily ameliorate something, but if we haven't fixed the root cause or addressed it, it's likely to just recur when there's less social pressure, clinical pressure. But, again, really helpful to be having those conversations.
I think it's helpful to even just be explicit about how complicated the area is. There's another question coming from Tova, I think, in relation to low wage, low quality, and how that can fill a similar role as cannabis. To make an imperfect analogy, if someone feels they don't have anything else going on, but they can get a job that gets them out of the house, gets them in connection with other people, it might really be worth it in the short term, even if long term it may trap them, especially if they're also being shunted by the service. And so, I mean, I think that's the thing sometimes, and services are guilty of this too, quick fixes, trying to get people out the door, because actually often that is the first step, but it's making sure that their horizons are broadened as well, and that actually the first step doesn't remain the only step. I mean, I think one of the things we've wrestled with both in this national programme but also in Glasgow is how much we should be advertising and kind of almost trying to break down the stigma about psychosis, and having some kind of advert on the telly or public health campaign that's anti-stigma, and the worry that services often have that actually they'll be inundated with people who are maybe having anomalous experiences. They've not necessarily got psychosis, but they're distressed, and we can't manage that. So we have a bit of a battle about that within ourselves, and I don't think we've done anything about it nationally yet, because I think there's a feeling we need to get some services up and running so that there's somewhere to signpost people to before we start putting, you know, adverts on the radio like they did in Norway. I'm wondering if,
absolutely. And again, international kind of studies have shown worsening stigma vis-a-vis schizophrenia. And some of that is, you know, directly kind of correlated with media attention to, you know, alleged intersections of mental illness, typically described as psychosis or schizophrenia, involving violence, visible homelessness. So I mean, I'm far from convinced that the dominant approaches to stigma reduction that we see are doing anything to address psychosis, schizophrenia. And a further tension here could be, as I was sort of talking about, the extremely heterogeneous nature of who ends up in epi services, the clean-cut young professional who has a single non-recurring episode of psychosis is not the one experiencing really the pointy end of the stick in terms of stigma and social exclusion. That's the youth with ongoing, serious, significant symptoms that become visible, right, through maybe not bathing or, you know, kind of what we call self-care, right, and drug use, certainly, like, you know, as a coping strategy. And these campaigns that present sanitized young people with psychosis who look just like your, you know, your neighbor who's going to Oxford or Cambridge, right? Like that is not a way to reduce stigma against those who are visibly kind of disabled and distressed. And we don't even try, like literally, like being very familiar with the stigma literature, I'm not aware of any even attempt to actually reduce stigma against, you know, kind of the people who are really, really suffering from it. So I think there's, again, a whole conversation to be had about the costs of, and the same thing in epi, when we overemphasize, right, a certain type of young person going through who has a certain type of successful outcome, and we're not really, really kind of focusing on those with the highest level of needs, which is something we see all around the world, and in, you know, news media stories that focus on how incredible and miraculous epi can be. And this is not a criticism of epi. This is a criticism of really everywhere one goes, social stratification plays out, and we tend to prioritize certain people over others. And it's not a criticism of epi. It is a problem wherever and whenever we do it, right? And this is why the theme of this presentation really is social and structural determinants. It really is taking us back to who needs it most, right? And that we need to prioritize them, not serve other people, but prioritize them and prioritize needs that are going to be profoundly shaped by poverty, among other things.
Yeah, and I agree completely. I think, I mean, the focus on mental health in Scotland has been about the mild to moderate end, counsellors in secondary schools, the heat target for psychological therapies, and it actually has disadvantaged already marginalised groups, because people with psychosis don't ask to see a psychologist. They don't get on the waiting list in the first place. So I feel quite strongly that some of these targets that are focusing on mental health and young people are actually missing the people that need it the most. So I completely agree, and it's really helpful to have your much broader kind of context to back up our argument. So thank you, Nev. That was very, very, very helpful conversation. There's another point from somebody about stigma and suddenly everyone being aware of their mental health and expecting to be you know, treated or not judged or discriminated against, but it's not extending to people with severe mental illness. They're more marginalised and they don't have the same social media connections, etc. And I agree with that. There's another comment come in about, just a thank you really to say what an informative talk, and wondering if there's any partnerships with education colleagues in EIP services for young people in the US in terms of supporting young people with psychosis to remain in education and to increase general awareness and education around psychosis.
Yeah, so this is actually one of my major areas of focus, because I see education as pretty kind of fundamental to socioeconomic mobility in the US. I have created 2 pretty extensive toolkits on higher education and early psychosis. the challenge when I've brought these up or used these in international contexts before is like, you know, the laws, both the limitations of them and the strengths of them, right, are so variable across national contexts. The way that universities are configured in the US, the access issues, the financial issues in terms of higher education financing are really different, but I can probably just put them in the link right now. I have heard of, so I speak on this all the time, and therefore I end up like people come up and talk to me. There have been initiatives in England over the years that not a lot is available about on the internet, but let me just kind of post some of the work. And then I will say I have a major grant right now from the National Institute of Mental Health here that is looking rather focally at what do we do to improve educational outcomes. We have sites all over the US looking at this in early psychosis settings, also trying to understand experiences after EIP around education and career development. So I'm doing a ton of work actively on this, but also these prior toolkits are certainly resources. So I think I can get I think this should work. And again, I think it just doesn't, unfortunately, resources often don't directly translate between countries, but I think kind of something like this is certainly valuable. So this is the student and family edition. Then there is one specifically for the campus staff and administrators. So it's really trying to reach people in charge at the university. How do you transform your environment? How do you create structures that are supportive of students with psychosis, et cetera? So there are two different toolkits, and then I have a linkage guidance for providers working in US EPI settings. What can the provider do? But it's not just the EPI teams that need to do this. You have to get post-secondary institutions on board and changing policy. So I think this should work. So that's both of them up there. There's other initiatives in the US, I can say, certainly to do early detection. And I mean, this is not who I am as a person, as an advocate, right? I don't think it's just that we need to find people with early psychosis. I think we need to build structural supports in these settings that are really conducive to community integration and inclusion. So there certainly is a lot more happening there, where it's just like, how do you just go into settings and teach people to detect, and then refer out to clinical services? And I could, certainly kind of connect people if you're interested in sort of US folks who are doing a lot in that space. But I think what's more unusual is saying, actually, we need to fundamentally transform the spaces. We need there to be supports and supportive structures in place, so that we just don't run into providers working with a young person who's like, well, I'm not supported. I'm not going to make it through. I'm not even going to make it through a semester in this program. The provider can't fix that if there are not supports and structural change on the side of educational institutions. So I really push for that piece.
Thank you for sharing these. That's very good of you, because we actually do have, certainly in Glasgow and in our new Pathfinder services, one of the things they are doing is improving the relationship with higher education, all kinds of universities, colleges, whoever's nearby. And we've certainly got quite good relationships with our university colleagues in Glasgow. There's a number of universities in Glasgow, and I think there are some real challenges with supporting people with psychosis back to education, and actually for us, there's also an issue with foreign students and people who can really fall between the gaps in terms of service provision, and with immigration status thrown in there to complicate things too. So these resources look really useful. Thank you for sharing them. I'm slightly conscious of time, and I don't think we've got any more questions, so I'm going to hand over to Ashley to wrap up. But thank you from all of us, Nev, for taking the time to speak to us. It's been a really, really fascinating talk, and just so highly relevant to the work we're doing. So I'm very grateful to you for your time. Thank you very much. And I'm hoping that we can share our website with Nev so that she has the link. There are some interesting case studies and some bits and pieces of our program that we've been doing, and some of our previous speakers, which you might find interesting and relevant if you have time. So thank you again for your talk today.
Thanks, Susie, and thank you very much, Nev. I'll just echo what Susie said there. A really, really fascinating presentation on so many levels, and gives us a lot to think about with where we're at in terms of our programme, and you know, and where we go next with what we're trying to do. I think that was, yeah, I think that's all the questions in the chat box. I would just ask anybody who's left online, we've got a poll about to come up on the screen. If you wouldn't mind just taking less than a minute just to answer a poll, and it just helps us improve these webinars moving forward, and gives us an idea of what we can do to make them better. So I think that's on the screen for you just now. There should be 3 that you can slide along to, and then you're able to submit your answers on that. And once you've done that, I just would like to also say thanks everybody for coming and listening to the webinar today. I hope you got something out of it, and you know, it gave you something to take away and think about. We have got just a closing slide here, which if you use the QR code, it does take you straight to our webinar. We've also got an email address if you're interested in being added to our mailing list or to get in contact with us about anything specific. Please do drop us an email or go to our website. Our next webinar will be at the start of December, and details about that one will be coming out really soon. So thanks again for attending, and again a massive thank you to Nev for taking our time to come and speak to us about a really fascinating topic, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much, everyone.